Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Chapter 13a. Today we are going to talk about the Ciliophores again, also known as the ciliates. We talked about them last time, and we're going to add some more this time. Okay, first I just wanted to show you that when we're talking about these things, we're not just talking about the one or two examples that I give to you. There are so many different types of ciliates and flagellates and amoebas and things like that it'd be hard to count them all. This right here, this image, is just a few of the types of ciliates. Okay, and you can see some of them are looking very different than others. Okay. First off, I want to talk about the process of binary fission, which is the method of asexual reproduction for the ciliates. I know we talked about it with bacteria, and it is very, very similar. Okay, if you look at the top, you'll see this ciliate known as the paramecium, which we mentioned before. Okay. Basically what happens is you have this macronucleus and the micronucleus. Macro means big, micro means small. And they multiply, and then you have the organism, the single cell, divide down the middle, and you end up with two identical paramecium that way. That method of dividing down the middle, kind of being cut in half across the width of it, is known as transverse binary fission. It's cutting it across the middle, not the other way. Okay, now I know this is a picture of a flagellate, but I wanted to distinguish between transverse and longitudinal binary fission. Okay, for Euglena, the one, remember, that has photosynthesis, they actually have binary fission, but it doesn't cut them in the middle. So they still go through the process of the chromosomes replicating and so on, but instead of dividing across the width of the organism, it actually divides down the length of the organism, and that is longitudinal binary fission. Okay, now you're going to need to pay attention to the micronucleus and the macronucleus when it comes to the methods of sexual reproduction. The macronucleus, the larger of the two, is responsible for the internal functioning of the cell. However, the micronucleus is any type of genetic information that gets passed from generation to generation. Okay, so there's a difference there. You also will notice up on the top the mention of this cyst, and this is just a form that a lot of microorganisms take whenever they are in a situation where they would die. For example, if something dried out or it got too hot, something like that, instead of just dying, they actually will form this cyst, which is kind of like a hard little bubble that keeps their genetics alive, so that when the conditions are right again, they kind of pop out and there they are again. Okay? So realize that that's a survival technique that a lot of these microorganisms have. Now next, this will show you the actual binary fission of the paramecium. I am going to speed it up for you because we don't need to watch it for 3.5 minutes. Okay, but I do want you to see the whole process. Okay, so it's 2 times speed. You can see that it is dividing down the middle across the width. got attacked there a little bit, so it jiggled off to the sides. And you can see other microorganisms moving around. And you can tell it is pinching in farther and farther, each one becoming more distinct from the other. And you can see the cilia on these quite clearly as they're moving around. And they're almost separated. Getting close. And you can see they take on the classic paramecium shape the closer they get to actually being split and divided from each other too. Okay, they're starting to separate and pull apart from each other. They are almost there. And separation. Okay, so those were both genetically identical to each other. Okay, going on to sexual reproduction. Basically what you have is we're going to be talking a lot about those micronuclei again. First off, what happens, if you look at number 1, is two paramecia line up, and they actually will partly fuse together. Their bodies actually partially join each other, and they become connected. Okay, they have the different colors for the micronuclei just so you can see the differences. Okay, and primarily they line up at the oral grooves. They're the equivalent of the mouth. Now, the micronucleus itself goes through meiosis. And if you remember, in the process of meiosis, you have 4, in this case, micronuclei created, okay, from one. And they are different, okay? Each one of these is different than the other. The DNA, remember, in meiosis gets scrambled. However, out of those 4 which are different, 3 of them disintegrate. Okay, so already there's a genetic difference. Now, for step 3, whichever one remains, it splits and doubles. Okay, so now you have 2 in each cell that are identical. Then the 2 paramecia, the cells, exchange their micronuclei, one of each, so that each micronuclei now has is different within the cell. Okay, but identical in each. So this red one and this red one would be the same. This blue one would be the same. But the blue and the reds would be different. But they've switched. Okay. Then what happens is the cells separate. They have these different combinations now of DNA in their micronuclei. And what ends up happening is they join together and create a new combination of DNA. Okay, so that's the genetic information. Now, the thing is, the macronucleus, the part that actually controls what's going on in the cell, and the micronuclei go through cell division twice. So you end up with 4 identical ones. Okay, and there'd be another cilia over here, or another paramecia doing the same thing over here. And then what happens is the cell itself will divide, and you'll end up with 4 new cells. So you start with 2 cells, and after it divides and goes through all of this genetic change, each one of those 2 cells is going to divide to make 4, so you end up with a total of 8 cells. Okay? So you start with 2 that are genetically different, you end up with 8 that are genetically identical. Okay? And that is called conjugation, which basically just means to join together. Okay, here is a video on what conjugation actually looks like in paramecia. You can't see all the details of the micronuclei, but it at least gives you an idea of what it looks like. Okay, and you can see that they are quite significantly fused together. Okay, something that happens kind of rarely, but it does happen, is where you have something called autogamy. And that is sexual reproduction because there's genetic change, but there's only one parent. Okay, so starting up at the top. Okay, the macronucleus breaks apart and kind of disappears. The micronuclei, which there are 2 of in this case, actually will divide by meiosis, and they're going to end up making the 8. So in that way, it's kind of similar. You start, each one ends up with 4. Now, each of those, you now have 8. 7 of the 8 are going to disappear. Okay? So what happens is in the process of meiosis, these 8 are all different. Remember, again, meiosis scrambles the DNA. So you end up with 8 different ones. One of them survives, and then it is going to divide into 2. Okay, so it is similar, but not the same as conjugation. Then they are going to combine together. And what ends up happening is you end up with twice the amount of DNA as is needed for a micronucleus. It then is going to divide twice, just like before. So you're going to end up with 4 of the micronuclei instead of just 1, but they're all identical. And what happens is 2 of them become micronuclei and 2 of them become macronuclei. So it has twice the information here. And then finally, what happens is what looks like binary fission, and the cell divides. And you end up with basically what you started with, but these 2 that are created by autogamy are genetically different than what you started with, because you have the scrambling of the DNA by meiosis in this early step. So even though it is one parent, these 2 cells are genetically different than the one parent that started with it. Okay? Just kind of a little information on survival in the microscopic world. What you're about to see is the reality of what life is like for a ciliate. Both of these organisms that you see are ciliates, different kinds. And you can probably guess what's about to happen. One of the ciliates becomes supper for the other. Okay? A very large food vacuole, if you will. Okay, so you can tell it is now enclosed, and within a minute or so is going to be supper, completely and totally. Okay, now some organisms have a way to defend themselves. Okay, did I skip something? No. Okay. There are these structured called trichocysts, and you can see it spelled right here. And this, to explain what's going on, this right here that you're going to see is a type of paramecium. It doesn't have the classic shape, but it's going to, the creator of this video actually released something that's toxic to the paramecium. So what you're going to see is these hair-like things called trichocysts be released to protect itself. Okay, so there it is, happily swimming along. And you saw all those hairs release. Those are trichocysts. Now, the cell is dead at this point. That's why it stopped moving. Because it was too toxic for it to overcome. And also that way it could continue to be filmed. Now, sorry. Okay, if you look at the diagram of the paramecium over here, what you'll see is you have all the cilia on the outside, but inside you have all these little bumps that are shown. If you look close up over here on the left, you will see the trichocysts. And these basically are defensive spikes. Okay, if you look on the right, this is a photograph of a trichocyst. Okay, so this is this equivalent of the skin of the paramecium here. And you can see this spike. What happens is if it gets touched or threatened in some way where it is going to end up being killed or food for something else, they have the ability to shoot these things out, and they contain a toxin that causes either the food or the predator to become either dead or paralyzed, depending on what it is. So it is definitely a world that is full of danger and intrigue when you're talking about defending yourself. So there is a battle going on between organisms that we cannot see. Okay, next time we are going to go on to the last group, and we'll let you know from there. Okay, until next time.